Hey guys, Akio Murasaki here. In this video we are going to be talking about localizations again, just as we did in the previous video. If you don't know my stance on localization, I just want to be clear and honest straight from the get-go. I very thoroughly do not like localizers. I would like most of them to be gone and most of them to be replaced with AI, in fact, yes. Because they're an active detriment to Japanese to EN translations and have been for the last, and I'm looking at my fingers here, counting a little bit, 20, 30, I think by that time, probably over 30 years. Yes, that's how long EN localizations have been done, and they've always been trash. That's kind of the reality of the situation for different reasons. Initially, they've been trash because there's been basically no proof, no proofing, no checking process whatsoever, and more recently they've been trash because localizers on average do not really care about Japanese culture. Yes, there is a couple of features that localizers show. First one, they thoroughly hate Japanese culture. They think it's a pedo country, it's some kind of weird patriarchy kingdom, and this is the funny thing, they like the anime aesthetic, but they hate everything about the culture that's behind that aesthetic, yes. You'll see this very common among anime localizers, I guess, and also voice actors and voice actresses. That's a very common sentiment. The other thing is that they always use, for whatever reason, they always use extreme examples for why something cannot be translated properly from Japanese to English. But 5 to 10% edge cases and not the majority of actual issues. And the other thing is that they somehow think that their minority position, highly progressive, super liberal position is representative of not only the entire US when it comes to EN localizations, but also the entirety of the English-speaking West. Yes, 1-2 localizers think that they represent the entirety of the West, as wild as it sounds. However, here we have a bit of an unusual and unique situation. We have Neil Broadley, who's a localization director, has been posting quite a bit recently on Twitter. And what's impressive is his personal history. He's been doing the Saga series for the last 10 years, has been working at Square Enix for 15, and has been actually living in Japan for the last 25 years, which already puts him light years ahead of the majority of localizers who don't even interact with Japanese culture and only do it for their localization work. Let's see what Neil has to say about localizations. There are probably some points I will disagree with, obviously, but maybe also some points I will agree with. Let's see. Let's get started. Okay, so the first post. With fantasy, for example, devs aren't trying to create a Japanese-feeling fantasy world. That is actually true, yes. If you've played Japanese JRPGs, a lot of them are kind of more like medieval, Western-centric. They're not trying to be Japanese in a way. They're trying to emulate this kind of medieval Western feel to it. Even though obviously the language is Japanese and they're very often using fairly archaic Japanese, they're trying to emulate, the sort of European feel to it. They're trying to create a fantasy world that feels authentic to their audience, who are Japanese people. Yes and no at the same time. Language-wise, they're trying to, as I said, make the language archaic, but otherwise they're not necessarily trying to make the game, Japanese easy, kind of. They want their Western audience to experience an authentic fantasy world too. That is also true. I've seen this in multiple discussions among Japanese developers and kind of the English localizers in the past, especially when it comes to a recent bigger work. I think it was Unicorn Overlord, and also earlier titles from the same team, where they very clearly wanted the Western players to get a similarly authentic medieval experience to what they originally intended. Therefore, I don't think anything's wrong with this post. Yeah, let's move on to the next one. Let's see. More than anything, natural feeling sentences are the goal. The JP player has a smooth, natural experience, so the EN player should too. Okay, nothing wrong with that. JP feeling EN sentences create barriers and needlessly utter a culture for those without a certain threshold of pre-existing knowledge. I'm not quite sure what he means by JP feeling EN sentences, but it's also true that there are some rare cases where the localization is a little too literal, so kind of, well, in that sense, no localization was actually done, and just a basic translation of the Japanese text was done. There are very few cases like this, but they do exist, in which case the English sentences obviously feel stilted, but it's and jarring, as someone puts it, but this is mostly because they haven't been made to feel naturally. It's a common, it's, as I said, very rarely happens nonetheless. But I'm trying to understand here, create barriers and needlessly utter a culture for those without a certain threshold of pre-existing knowledge. I mean, if the sentences are in English, there is no pre-existing knowledge that is required here. I have a feeling that he's talking about something very specific, so I'm kind of confused. Then he's mentioning below here, he's mentioning best practices for anime. Yeah, let's go to the next post. Also, one thing I forgot to point out at the very beginning, the way he approaches the topic of localization, which is going to be apparent in many of these posts, is through the lens of number one, a game localizer, and number two, a localizer of fantasy games, of kind of medieval-ish fantasy games, which is then going to be noticeably different from, let's say, the approach, as he also points out here, for best practices in the case of anime or in the case of manga, for instance. And of course, the setting of each matters quite a lot as well, obviously. But okay, so far mostly good. Yeah, let's see next one. Yeah, so I think here for instance, we're already getting into some controversial issues. JP honorifics. I think this topic is very divisive in kind of like the weeb community. I'm gonna share my opinion straight away here. I personally think that unless necessary, JP honorifics should be actually removed in the English version, because there's something specific to Japanese, and it's not really possible to really properly convey the same feeling and the same meaning in English. And often in a lot of these cases, it's simply not possible to just, have this honorific and that being meaningful in English. I mean, obviously, if someone knows what the honorifics mean, and it's also a learning opportunity for quite a lot of players, but in general, they simply do not work in English. And also, I find it actually funny because the example he gives here is not a very good one. So leaving in JP honorifics is something I don't ever see myself doing. Fair, because I don't translate works set in Japan. I mean, yeah, so as I mentioned, he's doing kind of medieval-ish game localizations. Works set in Japan, I don't think that has any bearing whatsoever, because honorifics are an aspect of the language. They're not an aspect of the setting. Very important point to make here. JP players don't read Garrett-sama and think, whoa, that's so Japanesey. It's just a natural address for a noble in JP. So Lord Garrett in English, it's natural. That is actually a very bad example. I think someone later did point out in this thread, that is a terrible example. First off, addressing a noble in JP. Sama doesn't just mean noble. It's a specific from low social register to a very high social register address. It's not always going to be a noble. That's not how it works. Japanese honorifics are about social structures. They're also about the relationship between two characters, and therefore the same honorific can have different meanings depending on the situation. Like for instance, the kun honorific is typically used for boys in school, like when they're being addressed by other boys or by girls, but it's also a honorific that's used for girls when like an older male colleague at work addresses them, they can also use kun. Like for instance, when it's like a superior or either the chateau, the company president can use kun to address a person of a lower social and company rank with that honorific. So again, this is a very, very, very specific example and does not really extend to how honorifics in Japanese work. So again, it's kind of like an edge case and not a very good one. Okay, some people have asked about translators' footnotes for video games, even if the majority wanted that, they don't. I can see that being the case. I can see how the majority of English-speaking players would not want honorifics in their games. That totally makes sense. The logistical issues are insurmountable. That is not true. We already don't have the room to fit all the text we need to in English. Again, that's very strange, okay. Let alone longer languages like French, German, and Spanish. How are these languages longer? There has to be a joke. No way German is longer than English. No. I'm sorry, I am absolutely not buying that. There are ways, like, we are not living in the 1980s. Text frames and text boxes are not limited typically by size and the number of characters. So I know this, I'm sorry, this is not a good argument whatsoever. A better argument is the one he makes here and the one that I highlighted, that yes, the majority in the end would not want, I know it might be surprising, but I don't think the majority of players of Japanese games would in fact appreciate translator footnotes. I personally would, but then again, I mostly play Japanese games in Japanese, so it really does not apply to me. However, the majority of people would not. I am simply not buying the second argument that some languages are longer. I really don't think they are. No, this is a cop-out. This is, again, some kind of bad faith argument. Let's see, next one. There is an interesting discussion to be had about how much a localization should attempt to teach about the original culture. I want to bring the original work's ideas to a broader audience, many of whom want to enjoy a quality work regardless of the point of origin. Yeah, that's a very good point. Nevertheless, counterpoint to this, I don't agree that the EN localization should erase anything that is Japanese about the game. And here I'm talking specifically about games or anime or manga that are specifically set in Japan, so things that Neil does not work on, ironically. If, for instance, people are eating yakisoba in the game, that yakisoba should not be removed. The word yakisoba should not be removed, or should be replaced with like a descriptor of like fried noodles, for instance, or fried noodles with something. A way to not remove the cultural aspect of it, to preserve it, but also allow people who don't necessarily understand specific Japanese words to be able to appreciate it as well. So yes, the teaching aspect is there. We're simply not dropping people into hot water and forcing them to instantly learn words they might not be familiar with. But again, very rare cases, and again, for settings, for specifically Japanese settings. Not something Neil works on, not something we are discussing here. But yeah, just a small tangent. The next one, the onigiri jelly donut example from Pokemon fascinates me. Yeah, a lot of people still keep talking about it, because I get why the choice was made, even if I wouldn't have made it myself. Okay, that's a winning point. He wouldn't have made it himself. And that jelly donut makes absolutely no sense. It never should have happened, because that looked nothing like a jelly donut. Someone in that thread brought up later on that jelly donuts look completely different in English. So if you are, and this is the thing, it's in an anime, you see the pictures, you cannot simply erase everything and make everything, instantly approachable to English-speaking players or viewers or whatever. Because the thing is there, you can clearly see it is not a jelly donut, it's a rice ball. And that's what it should have been called. And onigiri kept the name, add translator notes, or simply say rice ball. It would have been so much easier, but no, jelly donut. Mistake of a century. And one of the reasons why, another tangent, I just want to point out that the reason why people are consistently bringing up this argument is because onigiri is an aspect of Japanese food culture. And like many other aspects, it is being actively removed, actively erased in anime, specifically set in Japan. There's been, I think, a dub line where yakisoba was, for instance, replaced with a $5 footlong. Yakisoba was not in the picture, so I guess saving grace for the localizers. But still, why would you do this? The action is set in Japan. Why would you erase the entire Japanese aspect of the anime, of the scene, if it's there, if it's part of the experience? It sounds very bigoted to me, and kind of almost like cultural appropriation, I guess. But yeah, he's on quote-unquote our side when it comes to the onigiri jelly donut discussion. Okay, let's see later on. And this is two posts here side by side, because I think this is one of the cruxes that I think I pointed out earlier localizers fall into, which is how they see themselves as being representative of the entire English-speaking world. Now, the good thing is that Neil is actually aware of this problem. So he mentions one unique responsibility of the EN localization is serving a wide audience. 90% of the French players are French. Only around half my audience is native English speakers. This is a big thing. He's perfectly aware of that being an issue. Fewer than that are Americans. So not only 50% only are EN natives, English speaker native speakers, but also fewer than this are actually Americans, which basically means that when you are translating something into English, you absolutely cannot load your localization with Americanisms. You cannot load it with things that would only be relatable to US English speakers. And this is a very common problem with both manga and anime localizations, where localizers are notorious for loading the localization with quirks, with online humor, with jokes, with things that really only make sense to them, and also political messaging quite often, that only makes sense to them, would not make sense to 90%, or even more than 90% of people out there who are going to be consuming the EN localization of the product. Wild, right? But again, Neil is aware of this, and this is a good thing. However, unfortunately, the next thing he says does seem to contradict this noticeably. Like he mentions, oh, sorry. Oh, my bad. Nope, this is that one. That one I wanted to see here. In EN native speakers, in EN, so in English, native speakers tend to use things like exaggeration, sarcasm, similes, metaphors, absurdity, and the like in conversation. This is an important point. To a much greater degree than JP native speakers do. When absent, the dialogue feels false. EN localizations add them in, yes. But we've already known that. We've seen this in localization practices around the world, in English localizations, every single one of them. Well, say for one. No, in the majority of them. JP localizations remove them. Okay, let's leave JP localizations aside for now, not very important. Let's focus on the EN side. See, that does contradict. So we're talking about native speakers. So now he somehow does no longer care about the majority who are not native speakers. So we're talking about 50% here. And when he's talking about exaggeration, sarcasm, similes, metaphors, the ones that are used in the US, like if you take US English and British English, you can actually spot British people on Twitter by how they use English. Yes, it's so markedly different. So this is a weird thing to contradict the previous post, where he kind of made it a point to highlight that the majority of people who are consuming his games are in fact not US Americans. And is what he's saying even true? Like, the like in conversation to a much greater degree than JP native speakers do. Maybe sarcasm, maybe similes, absurdity, I guess, but not actually metaphors. And also exaggeration, but not metaphors. JP people do actually use metaphors quite a lot in conversation. I've seen it multiple times. But there's another point to be mentioned here. I mean, several actually, but a very important one. Here he is mentioning conversation. Now, one thing he does not seem to consider is that the language used in games is very often already exaggerated. And this is even more the case in anime and manga. So yeah, obviously it's Japanese that people are going to use somewhere out there, but it's very often super exaggerated Japanese. Yes, that is actually the case. So we're talking about a language that's already like toned up from a 5 to, let's say, like a 7 or an 8. And then EN localizations add them in. So we're basically going from an exaggerated 8 to essentially like an 11. And this is where things start getting out of hand, because you start noticing how a lot of the language in EN localization is just way over the top, even for English speakers. It's simply too much. And also, the dialogue feels false. I don't agree with this. It actually does not. It simply feels neutral. And depending on the setting, sometimes neutral is actually the correct choice. If we're dealing with a game, set in like a post-apocalyptic world, where everything's dark and grim and sad and depressing, you don't want super exaggerated humor in it. You don't want, quirky chungus jokes. You don't want millennial writing. You want it to be neutral. You want it to be dark, which is not what you're going to get in an English localization, for instance. That's for sure. And yeah, EN localizations add them in. That is absolutely the case. But I don't agree with the justification. See, the justifications that EN localizers very often use are highly subjective. The dialogue feels false. False to whom? False to you, maybe? Not false to, millions of people out there who are going to be consuming the product. This is a subjective you opinion and not a subjective everyone opinion. That's something localizers don't really consider properly, and I'm sad to see Neil going that route as well. So what else do we have? So the one I skipped before. A character who is a lovable doofus should be just that in all languages. Okay, agreed. But what makes a character endearing in JP can make them seem stalkery in EN if the text is translated literally. Oh my god. The writer would be very upset if the EN audience came across with a different perception. And yes, what do you mean by stalkery? Lovable doofus stalkery. I feel like there is a line. There is a very broad line, in fact. And how do you get from A to B? This makes completely no sense. Why would you assume that all of the players are going to interpret the character the exact same way? And see, there are a lot of cases in especially game localizations where localizers find something problematic, they find something abhorrent even, and they will simply say, oh no, we cannot have this. Like, EN players, they cannot have a bad impression of that character. What they really do not understand is that them being, even in, to some minor extent stalkery, is a part of the character. You might not like it, but that makes the character more three-dimensional. They're not just a goody two-shoes. If you have a character that has good features and bad features, and then you suddenly flatten out all of the bad features, congratulations, you've only made a character who can ever only be good. And also, contrary, in some games, they take these bad features, they kind of try to, polish them, to try to smooth them out to the point where they end up with something even worse. Yeah, like for instance, I can remember, I think in the Valkyrie Chronicle games, there is a scene where a character is kind of trying to complain on a guy, and then the way they like in Japanese it sounded okay, and then in English, because they didn't want her to complain at the guy, they made her punch the guy, which ended up her making look extremely hysterical, which is also another like weird stereotype that apparently is not very popular in English, and I'm not surprised why. But yeah, they made the matter worse, actually. So I really disagree with this point. I think this is again subjective issue and not like an objective objective will get the same impression about it. So no, I do not actually agree. Let's see, we have some more points. This is an interesting one. It's not uncommon for people to outgrow localizations as they get more familiar with works from the same culture. Tropes that once seemed foreign become familiar, and you grow to appreciate them. I get that, and that's where knowing your audience informs a localizer's choices. Yeah, I want to say that's actually true, but the majority of localizers actually do not know their audiences, especially when it comes to manga and anime. They go for kind of some weird, lowest common denominator of an audience that spends all of their time online and is just weird. My personal experience, I did actually outgrow the Final Fantasy V localization. I know quite a lot of people, especially localizers, are praising it because the EN localization added flavor to the otherwise quote-unquote boring game in the form of Kafka, for instance, and in the form of all of the writing and everything. Even as I remember playing Final Fantasy V, I have to say the corny, the quirky language choices and jokes, they really do stand out, and they really kill the vibe of the game, because Final Fantasy V is actually a fairly dark game. Like, there's a lot of dark things happening in it, including slavery, for instance. So adding all of these kind of weird jokes is just really out of place. It makes no sense. And especially pop references, things that localizers notoriously do, they're going to age instantly. No one's going to remember what you meant with this one Christmas joke 20 years ago when playing the game now more recently. So yeah, if you're a localizer, please don't ever add them. That's absolutely horrible. But let's see what else Neil has here. Okay, this one's an interesting one. If a line would make a JP player laugh, the EN translation should make an EN player laugh. Okay. The devs want to elicit laughter and chose words to serve that goal, but humor is intertwined with culture. That is actually true. So the words might have to change to reach the goal. That is localization. I see what is happening here. I see what's happening here. It's one of these words have no meaning kind of attitudes. I see this extremely prevalent among localizers, unfortunately. I do see this quite a lot. So what he's basically saying is that it doesn't matter what the words actually say. It matters that there was a joke and the JP players laughed, and so you're supposed to put in a joke to make the EN players laugh. So words might have to change to reach the goal. And the thing that's very common with localizations to English, to other languages, as I've seen, is that the first thing localizers do is that they completely ignore of what's actually being said. They just like, okay, the characters laugh, let's just spin it up, let's just throw in a joke, let's just throw in a random joke. Now, what they don't realize is that by bastardizing how the text is being delivered, they might end up not only giving a completely different impression of the character, but also if you have a Japanese voiceover, the character says something totally different from what they're saying in English. So yeah, it's going to be a joke in English, it's going to be a joke in Japanese, but the impression of the character might be totally different. And that's something the localizers don't really understand. And I'm sad to see Neil walking the same line here. I want to give him a little bit the benefit of the doubt, considering that he has a lot of experience. But this is like the third L at this point, I think, or the fourth one. So I really do not agree with a lot of these points. No, if there is a joke in the Japanese version, the joke should be translated accordingly. So not only a joke, not only something that made the players laugh, or like a situation that made the players laugh, but a direct equivalence of that situation. And it might surprise some people, especially the ones who don't actually speak Japanese. I'd say the majority of the audience of EN localizations. A lot of phrases, a lot of expressions, a lot of kind of ideas do actually translate directly from Japanese. So there's no reason to just, toss out what's being said in Japanese and then put in your whatever English joke to humor the audience. There's absolutely no reason to do that. And someone who, someone who understands the culture very well and understands the two languages very well is not going to get this, unfortunately. They're going to say, okay, this is a funny joke, but it's not funny enough. And they're going to replace it. And I do not like that. That's a bad route to go. Localizers should not be doing stuff like that. And that's one of the reasons why I genuinely would like them gone, But okay, we have a couple of comments here from users related to the topic. Let's see, I'm gonna address them. There's a lot of misconceptions when it comes to Japanese. But here we have Scratchpoint, who's one of the anti-localization people. What they say, the root issue of localization is often misattributed to politics, but political inserts in modern translations are a symptom of the problem of localization itself, a concept that has always enabled very loose interpretations of Japanese media. That is actually true, because as I pointed out with what Neil wrote earlier, what localizers very often do is that they try to aim for a whatever approximation of what the original Japanese says, and not what actually is being said in Japanese. Here lies the problem. If the industry was changed to operate on the premise of faithful translations being the goal, political inserts would no longer be an issue because the original work would always be translated with proper respect for the source material. An interesting point to be made here is that when it comes to, at least in my understanding, books are not localized. Books are translated. So if someone is translating the book, they are trying to align as closely as possible to what is being said in the original. For whatever reason, and something I do not understand, is why in anime, manga, and games, localizers take creative liberties when it comes to political or not. They do that. I don't know why. I don't know why anime, manga, and games are different than books. Why do you not want your product to have that cultural aspect to it? The goofy localizations of the past are rooted in the same disregard for the original work as the modern political nonsense. As I pointed out at the very beginning, there were previously no one cared. Now people intentionally care to misrepresent what's being said in the original because they very often hate Japanese culture. Even if one believes their intent back there was to entertain, which apparently was, rather than being intentionally malicious, the result being inaccurate is all the same and helped pave the way. That is actually true. The modern localization tradition is a result of the past mistakes and the past localizations, past poorly done localizations, creating a standard, an unwritten actually, standard based on subjective feelings and opinions of localizers, not an actual written standard of how localizations should be properly done, and also not one that is being apparently taught in translation studies. It's important to be clear about the problem so that it can be properly addressed and fixed for the better. Spoiler alert, it's never going to happen. The ultimate root cause is a process that sees fit to overwrite the original script. Yes, change that and the problem is resolved. No more political inserts, added slang jokes, or pop culture references when they do not belong. I wish we could live in a world like this. That is absolutely not happening. But let's see some other comments here. Text, dialogue, and art exists to communicate ideas and emotions, and this goes beyond the plain words being said. This is along the lines of the JP player laughed, English player laughed comment from Neil, where he's like, yeah, whatever the words mean, words don't mean anything. A direct translation of a Japanese text sounding robotic. This is a common misconception. That is absolutely not true. When it wasn't meant to, is of far greater damage to the artistic value of the story than not using exact words. The sounding robotic, I think a lot of this stems from people doing like kind of like on top fan translations, where they intentionally translate directly so that it's clear what the Japanese text originally said. These are never meant to be in any way representative of the actual localization process. They're just quick and dirty translations to kind of illustrate how much of the nuance of the original Japanese was lost in the localization process. But apparently, yes, all Japanese is robotic when translated into English, yada yada yada, not true. But I don't think there's any convincing these people, even when you give them very clear examples, because unfortunately, the irony is that they would need to understand a bit of Japanese, they would need to understand the cultural aspect of the Japanese language to even be able to relate to this. That is unfortunately not happening, so I can't unfortunately convince these people. And here's another comment. If you want zero changes and you want to just know exactly what was said in Japanese, then you should learn Japanese and play the Japanese version, which is what I do. And here's another poorly phrased point. English and Japanese are very different languages. You can't give 100% direct translation and end up with something readable. You can. You actually can. In the majority of cases, you can. There are very few instances when that's not possible. And I find it funny how this is always brought up. And then localizers and localization supporters always give the exact same edge cases of a random joke that ever appeared only once in some kind of anime and never again. I find it fascinating that these people, for instance, I don't know, they don't bring up kansei-ben, they don't bring up gyaru speech, they don't bring up genuine concerns that are fairly common. No, it's always kind of like an edge case and like, oh yeah, you know, they're totally different languages. You can't give 100% direct translation and end up with something readable. You know, you need to look at the phase of the moon because Japanese is so complex and so wild. None of this is true, I'm sorry to say. So yeah, a lot of yapping. That's gonna be it for this video. I hope you guys enjoyed it. I hope you enjoyed my deep dive into localizations, and yeah, wonder what you guys think of what Neil broadly said earlier, whether he's right, where he's wrong. Yeah, drop a comment under the video, and I see you guys in the next one. Mata ne!